The North Atlantic was angry that morning. Gray waves crashed against each other in endless succession, their white caps stretching to every horizon. Below the surface, where the chaos of the storm became a dull, muffled roar, a German U-boat crept through the dark waters at periscope depth. It was March 1944, and Captain Lieutenant Ernst Hoffman had been at sea for 43 days. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Inside the cramped control room, the air was thick with moisture, diesel fumes, and the accumulated sweat of 50 men living in a steel tube. Hoffman stood at the periscope, his hands gripping the handles as he slowly rotated the lens, scanning the surface above. The storm provided excellent cover. Allied aircraft rarely flew in weather like this, and convoy escorts would be focused on keeping their ships together rather than hunting submarines. His executive officer, Oberleutnant Klaus Weber, stood nearby, watching the depth gauges with the intensity of a man who knew that a single mistake could send them all to the bottom. They were running on battery power, the diesel engines silent to avoid detection. Every man aboard knew the drill. Silence was survival. A dropped wrench, a slammed hatch, even a loud conversation could give away their position to the hydrophones of a prowling destroyer. Hoffman made another sweep with the periscope. Nothing but waves and spray. He was about to order the boat deeper when something caught his eye. A shadow against the clouds, moving fast. Too fast. His blood went cold. An aircraft. In this weather. Impossible, yet there it was, dropping through the cloud base like a hunting falcon. Before he could shout the order to dive, the aircraft banked hard, and Hoffman saw its profile clearly for just an instant. Twin engines. Wooden construction. No mistaking that silhouette. A Mosquito. The British called it the Wooden Wonder. German U-boat crews had another name for it. They called it the Executioner. The Mosquito was already lining up its attack run, coming in low over the waves at a speed that seemed to defy physics. Hoffman's mind calculated distances and angles with the cold precision of a man who had survived 2 years of war at sea. From the moment he'd spotted the aircraft to the moment its weapons would reach his boat, he had perhaps 12 seconds. Maybe less. 12 seconds to decide whether to crash dive and hope the hull could withstand what was coming, or to stay shallow and try to shoot back with the deck guns. 12 seconds to choose between two kinds of death, because in his gut, Hoffman knew that survival was no longer one of the options. The Mosquito carried weapons that had been designed specifically to kill submarines, and the men who flew them had become terrifyingly good at their job. His hand moved to the diving alarm, but something made him hesitate. Some instinct, some calculation his conscious mind hadn't yet processed. The waves were high, visibility was terrible, and the Mosquito was coming in at an angle that seemed wrong somehow. There was a chance. A slim chance. But to understand why Hoffman hesitated in that moment, why he didn't immediately order the crash dive that every manual and every training exercise had drilled into him, you need to understand how the war beneath the Atlantic had changed. You need to understand how a wooden aircraft built from plywood and fabric glue had become the most feared submarine hunter in the Allied arsenal. You need to go back to the beginning, to when German U-boats ruled the Atlantic like wolves among sheep, and the Mosquito was just a desperate idea in the mind of an aircraft designer who refused to accept that his country was running out of metal. In 1939, when Nazi Germany launched its invasion of Poland and plunged Europe into war, the Kriegsmarine already had a weapon that would bring Britain to the edge of starvation. The U-boat, or undersea boat, was a submarine that had been refined and perfected in the years since the Treaty of Versailles had forbidden Germany from building such vessels. The restrictions had been ignored, and by the time war broke out, Germany had a fleet of U-boats and commanders who had been training in secret for years. Gross Admiral Karl Donitz, the architect of Germany's submarine warfare strategy, had developed a doctrine he called Rudel-Taktik. The British would come to know it by another name. Wolf Pack. The concept was simple but devastating. Instead of operating alone, U-boats would gather in groups, sharing information about convoy positions and attacking en masse. A single U-boat might sink 1 or 2 ships before being driven off by escorts. A pack of 10 or 15 could destroy an entire convoy in a single night. The early results were beyond even Donat's optimistic projections. In the first months of the war, U-boats roamed the Atlantic almost unopposed. British anti-submarine tactics were outdated, based on lessons from the previous war that no longer applied. Sonar was primitive, depth charges were inaccurate, and convoy escorts were too few and too poorly equipped. German U-boat commanders called this period the happy time. They would surface at night, use their diesel engines to catch up with convoys, and attack from within the columns of merchant ships themselves. The escorts, designed to detect submerged submarines, were helpless against boats that attacked from the surface where they were faster and more maneuverable. The tonnage figures told the story. In 1940, German U-boats sank over 4 million tons of Allied shipping. In 1941, that number climbed even higher. Britain was an island nation that depended on imports for survival. Food, fuel, raw materials, everything came by sea. If the U-boats could sink ships faster than they could be replaced, Britain would be forced to surrender regardless of how many soldiers it had or how determined its people were. Captain Lieutenant Gunther Pring became a national hero in Germany after penetrating the supposedly impregnable Royal Navy base at Scapa Flow and sinking the battleship Royal Oak. Otto Kretschmer was called the tonnage king for his incredible success against merchant shipping. Wolfgang Luth, Joachim Schepke, Engelbert Endres, these names became legends, their faces plastered on propaganda posters, their exploits celebrated in newsreels. Young men across Germany dreamed of joining the U-boat service, seeing it as the most glamorous and exciting way to serve the fatherland. The reality inside a U-boat was far from glamorous. The Type 7, which made up the majority of Germany's submarine fleet, was just over 200 feet long and barely 20 feet wide. Inside that cramped space, 50 men lived, worked, and fought for patrols that could last 2 months or more. There was no privacy, no comfort, barely enough room to move. The air was always foul, thick with diesel fumes, body odor, and the smell of mold that grew on everything in the constant dampness. Men slept in shifts, sharing bunks that were still warm from the previous occupant. Hot meals were a luxury reserved for the first few days of a patrol, before the fresh food spoiled and the crew was reduced to eating canned goods and hard bread. Water was severely rationed, used primarily for drinking and cooking. Washing was out of the question. By the end of a long patrol, the stench inside a U-boat was almost unbearable, though the men became so accustomed to it they no longer noticed. But the discomfort was nothing compared to the constant tension. At any moment, day or night, the alarm could sound. Destroyer detected. Aircraft spotted. Convoy in sight. The men would race to their stations, the boat would dive or surface or turn, and suddenly they would be fighting for their lives. A depth charge exploding nearby could crack pipes, shatter gauges, send men tumbling. A direct hit could crush the pressure hull like an eggshell, killing everyone aboard instantly. Or worse, it could damage the boat enough that it couldn't surface or dive properly, leaving the crew to die slowly as the air ran out or the batteries failed. Yet despite the dangers and hardships, morale in the U-boat service remained high during those early years. The men believed they were winning the war. Every ship they sank brought Britain closer to defeat. Every successful patrol was celebrated, every returning crew was treated as heroes. The losses, while growing, were still manageable. For every U-boat sunk, Germany was building 2 or 3 more. Donat's plan seemed to be working. Meanwhile, in Britain, the situation was becoming desperate. Prime Minister Winston Churchill would later write that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. Everything else, the bombing raids, the threat of invasion, the defeats in North Africa, all of it was manageable as long as Britain could maintain its lifeline across the Atlantic. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But if that lifeline was cut, if the U-boats succeeded in strangling British imports, the war would be lost. The Royal Navy and Royal Air Force threw everything they had into the battle. Convoy escorts were strengthened. New detection equipment was developed. Long-range patrol aircraft were deployed to hunt submarines far from shore. Slowly, painfully, the Allies began to develop the tactics and technology that would turn the tide. But they needed weapons. They needed aircraft that could range far out into the Atlantic, that could spot U-boats on the surface and attack before they could dive to safety. The problem was that Britain was running out of aluminum. Every fighter, every bomber, every transport aircraft consumed tons of the precious metal. The aircraft factories were working at maximum capacity, but they couldn't build enough planes to meet all the demands. Strategic bombers to attack Germany. Fighters to defend Britain. Patrol aircraft to hunt submarines. Training planes to produce new pilots. The list was endless, and the aluminum supply was finite. Into this crisis stepped a man named Geoffrey de Havilland. He was one of Britain's most experienced aircraft designers, with a career stretching back to the earliest days of aviation. He'd designed fighters in the previous war, and in the years since, he'd created some of Britain's most successful civil aircraft. Now, in 1939, with war declared and Britain desperate for new aircraft designs, de Havilland proposed something that seemed insane. He wanted to build a bomber out of wood. Not just any wood, but laminated plywood, layers of thin wood veneer glued together to create a material that was light, strong, and required none of the strategic materials that were in such short supply. The Air Ministry was skeptical. Wooden aircraft belonged to the previous war, to the era of biplanes and canvas wings. Modern aircraft were made of metal. They were faster, stronger, more durable. A wooden aircraft couldn't possibly compete with metal designs. But de Havilland persisted. He pointed out that Britain had an abundance of wood and an abundance of skilled woodworkers. Furniture factories could be converted to aircraft production. The same couldn't be said for aluminum, which required specialized facilities and was needed for so many other purposes. He also argued that a wooden aircraft, properly designed, could be just as fast and just as strong as a metal one. Perhaps even more so, since wood had some properties that made it superior to metal in certain applications. The key was in the construction technique. De Havilland proposed using a sandwich construction, with plywood skins separated by a core of lightweight balsa wood. The resulting structure would be incredibly strong for its weight, and the smooth plywood skin would create less drag than the riveted metal construction used in conventional aircraft. He claimed he could build an unarmed bomber that would be so fast it wouldn't need defensive guns. It could simply outrun enemy fighters. The Air Ministry remained unconvinced, but they were desperate enough to give de Havilland a contract to build a prototype. If his radical design worked, it would free up aluminum for other uses and provide Britain with a fast reconnaissance and bomber aircraft. If it failed, well, they'd only wasted a relatively small amount of money and some wood. The prototype that rolled out of de Havilland's factory in late 1940 looked like nothing else in the sky. It was sleek, elegant, with smooth curves and a streamlined nose. 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same type that powered the Spitfire fighter, were mounted in the wings. The fuselage was a teardrop shape, optimized for speed. There were no gun turrets, no defensive armament of any kind. The entire design philosophy was built around one concept: speed. The first test flight took place on November 25, 1940. Test pilot Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., the designer's son, took the aircraft up and immediately radioed back that it handled beautifully. More importantly, it was fast. Incredibly fast. Even with the engines throttled back, it was outpacing the Spitfires that had been sent up to escort it. When the test program was complete, the aircraft had achieved speeds of over 390 miles per hour, making it one of the fastest aircraft in the world. The Air Ministry suddenly became very interested. They ordered the aircraft into production under the designation Mosquito, and they began exploring all the different roles it could fill. Photo reconnaissance, bombing, night fighting, ground attack. The Wooden Wonder, as it quickly became known, proved to be incredibly versatile. But it was in the anti-submarine role that the Mosquito would make perhaps its greatest contribution to the war. By 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached a critical phase. U-boats were sinking ships faster than the Allies could replace them. New tactics and technology were helping, but what was really needed was the ability to hunt U-boats in their transit areas, to attack them before they reached the convoy routes. Long-range patrol aircraft like the Sunderland flying boat and the American Liberator bomber were doing good work, but they were slow and vulnerable. They needed something faster, something that could get to the hunting grounds quickly and escape if German long-range fighters appeared. The Mosquito seemed like an ideal candidate, but it would need modifications. Anti-submarine work required different equipment than bombing or reconnaissance. It needed radar to detect surfaced submarines. It needed weapons that could kill a submarine quickly, before it could crash dive to safety. And it needed the range to patrol far out into the Atlantic where the U-boats operated. The radar problem was solved with the introduction of air-to-surface vessel radar, a system that could detect objects on the water's surface from many miles away. The Mosquito's speed meant it could close the distance quickly once a contact was detected, giving the submarine crew less time to react. But the weapons problem was more challenging. Depth charges were the standard anti-submarine weapon, but they had limitations. They had to be dropped in a pattern around where the submarine was thought to be, and they had to sink to the right depth before exploding. A submarine that was still on the surface or had only just submerged might escape damage entirely. What was needed was a weapon that could penetrate the submarine's hull directly, a weapon that could kill it before it had time to dive. The solution came in the form of a massive 57mm automatic cannon. This weapon, adapted from a naval anti-aircraft gun, fired a shell that weighed nearly 6 pounds. The gun was designed to fire rapidly, putting multiple rounds into a target in quick succession. When mounted in the nose of a Mosquito, it gave the aircraft devastating firepower against surface targets. The 57mm shells were designed to penetrate thick armor before exploding. Against a U-boat's pressure hull, they were catastrophic. A single hit could punch through the outer hull and detonate inside, wreaking havoc on the internal systems. Multiple hits could crack the pressure hull itself, causing immediate flooding that would drag the submarine down. Even near misses could cause damage, since the shells would penetrate the water and potentially strike the hull below the waterline. But using this weapon effectively required incredible skill and nerves. The Mosquito had to approach at very low altitude, sometimes just 20 feet above the waves, flying straight and level to aim the gun. The 57mm cannon had significant recoil, which could affect the aircraft's stability at such low altitude. And the pilot had to hold the attack run for several seconds, giving the target time to shoot back or dive. The first Coastal Command Mosquitoes equipped with the 57mm cannon entered service in early 1943. The crews selected for these aircraft were experienced patrol pilots who had already proven themselves against U-boats. They underwent intensive training, learning to judge distances over water, to compensate for the gun's recoil, to time their attacks for maximum effect. The training was dangerous. Several aircraft were lost when pilots misjudged their altitude and flew into the sea. But those who mastered the technique became incredibly effective submarine hunters. The German U-boat crews, meanwhile, were about to face a weapon unlike anything they'd encountered before. The Type 7 U-boat's deck gun could engage aircraft, but it was designed for surface combat against other ships. The gun crew needed time to man their weapon, time to train it on the target, time to load and fire. Against a conventional patrol aircraft like a Sunderland, which attacked at relatively slow speeds and from higher altitude, they had a reasonable chance of driving it off or even shooting it down. Against a Mosquito screaming in at over 300 miles per hour just above the waves, they had no chance at all. The first encounters were devastating. U-boats that had grown accustomed to surfacing during daylight hours in areas where Allied air patrols were thin suddenly found themselves under attack by an aircraft that appeared seemingly from nowhere. The Mosquito's speed meant it could cover vast areas of ocean quickly, and its radar meant it could detect submarines far beyond visual range. By the time a U-boat crew spotted the incoming aircraft, it was often too late to dive. Captain Lieutenant Heinrich Müller was one of the first U-boat commanders to survive an encounter with a Mosquito armed with the 57mm cannon. His after-action report, filed in April 1943, conveyed the shock and terror of the attack. His boat had been transiting the Bay of Biscay in broad daylight, making good speed on the surface to recharge batteries after a night spent submerged. The weather was clear, visibility excellent. His lookouts were experienced men who had been at sea for years. They never saw the Mosquito until it was already firing. Muller's first indication that something was wrong was the sound, a rapid hammering that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then the deck erupted in explosions as the 57mm shells began impacting. The forward deck gun crew was killed instantly, their weapon destroyed. Shells punched through the outer hull, creating fountains of water as they struck below the waterline. The conning tower was hit repeatedly, the armored sides providing no protection against shells designed to penetrate much thicker armor. Muller ordered a crash dive, but it was already too late. The pressure hull had been breached in multiple places. Water was flooding into the boat faster than the pumps could handle. As the bow began to dip beneath the waves, Muller made the agonizing decision to surface and abandon ship. The Mosquito had already passed, its attack run complete, and was circling at a distance. Muller and his crew scrambled out onto the deck, launching life rafts and preparing to jump into the cold Atlantic water. The U-boat went down in less than 3 minutes. 47 men made it off. 5 didn't. A British destroyer arrived 2 hours later and picked up the survivors. Muller spent the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp, haunted by the memory of how quickly everything had gone wrong. From the moment he'd heard that terrible hammering sound to the moment his boat slipped beneath the waves, barely 4 minutes had passed. 4 minutes to go from confident hunter to helpless survivor. His report was circulated throughout the U-boat service. The Mosquito, it warned, was unlike any aircraft they had faced before. It was too fast to escape once spotted. Its weapon was too powerful to survive. The only defense was to never let it get close enough to attack, which meant remaining submerged during daylight hours or in areas where Allied air patrols were active. But remaining submerged meant traveling slowly on battery power. It meant taking longer to reach patrol areas or return to base. It meant fewer opportunities to attack convoys. The Mosquito, without sinking a single ship itself, was reducing the effectiveness of the entire U-boat fleet. Donitz recognized the threat immediately. He ordered modifications to U-boats to increase their anti-aircraft armament. Boats began carrying additional machine guns and even 20mm automatic cannons specifically for defense against aircraft. Crews were trained to fight back rather than immediately diving when spotted. Some commanders became quite aggressive, choosing to remain on the surface and shoot it out with attacking aircraft rather than diving and hoping to survive the depth charges that would follow. This worked against some aircraft, particularly the slower patrol planes that had to make steady, predictable attack runs. But against the Mosquito, fighting back was nearly suicidal. The wooden aircraft could absorb tremendous battle damage and keep flying. Its multiple wooden layers often prevented shells from penetrating completely, and even when they did, there were no vital metal structures to sever, no hydraulic lines to cut. Bullets and small cannon shells would punch neat holes through the plywood and out the other side without causing critical damage. Meanwhile, the Mosquito's 57mm cannon could destroy a U-boat in seconds. German gunners trying to track and hit an aircraft moving at over 300 miles per hour just above the waves found it nearly impossible. By the time they had the Mosquito in their sights, it had already fired and was pulling up and away. Some U-boat commanders tried waiting until the last possible moment to dive, thinking they could duck under the attack just before the Mosquito opened fire. This occasionally worked, but it was incredibly risky. If they misjudged the timing by even a few seconds, they would be caught on the surface with the boat in the vulnerable process of diving, unable to maneuver or fight back effectively. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was profound. The happy time was long over. Now every time they surfaced, they knew they might have only seconds before death arrived in the form of a wooden aircraft moving faster than seemed possible. The crews that had once seen themselves as hunters now felt like hunted prey. Nervous lookouts scanned the skies constantly, jumping at every distant speck that might be an aircraft. Commanders became more cautious, more conservative, diving at the slightest hint of danger. This caution saved lives, but it also reduced effectiveness. U-boats spent more time submerged, covering less distance, finding fewer targets. The Battle of the Atlantic was turning against Germany, and the Mosquito was one of the key weapons making that possible. By mid-1943, Allied losses to U-boats had dropped dramatically while U-boat losses had climbed to unsustainable levels. Dönitz was losing boats faster than new ones could be built, and the crews he was losing included his most experienced commanders. The new crews replacing them were younger, less experienced, and more frightened. They had heard the stories from survivors about the Mosquito and other Allied anti-submarine weapons. They knew the odds were against them. Going on patrol was no longer an adventure or a path to glory. It was a probable death sentence. Some crews made it through one patrol, maybe two. Few made it through three. The chance of surviving an entire tour of duty, typically 7 patrols, was statistically very low. Yet the U-boats kept going out, kept hunting, kept fighting. Orders were orders, and Germany was fighting for survival. Every ship they could sink meant one less cargo of weapons or food reaching Britain. Every convoy they could scatter meant delayed reinforcements for the invasion of Europe that everyone knew was coming. The U-boat crews accepted their fate with a fatalism that would have been unthinkable in the early days of the war. The Mosquito squadrons, meanwhile, were becoming more numerous and more capable. New tactics were developed to maximize their effectiveness. Mosquitoes would work in pairs or small groups, sharing radar contacts and coordinating attacks to give U-boats no chance to escape. Some carried rockets in addition to the 57mm cannon, giving them even more firepower. Others carried improved radar that could detect submarines in heavier seas or bad weather. Flight Lieutenant James Morrison was typical of the Mosquito pilots flying anti-submarine patrols in 1944. He'd started the war flying Spitfires during the Battle of Britain, then transferred to Coastal Command when he grew tired of the limited range and short missions of fighter operations. He wanted to hunt, to pursue the enemy deep into their own territory, and Coastal Command offered that opportunity. He'd flown Sunderland flying boats for a year before transitioning to Mosquitoes, and the difference was like moving from a cargo truck to a racing car. The Mosquito was faster, more agile, and more deadly than anything he'd flown before. The 57mm cannon had surprised him the first time he'd fired it. The noise was incredible even through his headset, and the recoil had pushed the nose down sharply. But after a few training missions, he'd learned to compensate, and now he could put shells on target from 800 yards away while flying just 30 feet above the waves. Morrison had already destroyed 3 U-boats and damaged several others. Each encounter followed roughly the same pattern. The radar operator in the seat behind him would call out a contact. Morrison would turn toward it, pushing the throttles forward to maximum power. The Mosquito would surge ahead, accelerating rapidly. At 5 miles out, they might catch a glimpse of the submarine on the surface. At 3 miles, the submarine crew would spot them and begin their dive. At 1 mile, Morrison would line up his attack run, dropping to wave top height. Then he'd fire, walking his shells along the length of the submarine's hull, watching the explosive impacts march from stern to bow. The entire engagement would last less than 30 seconds from visual contact to the moment he pulled up and away. Sometimes the submarine would explode immediately, the pressure hull breached catastrophically. More often, it would settle into the water, damaged beyond repair but not immediately sinking, giving the crew time to evacuate. Morrison never circled back to attack survivors in the water. That wasn't warfare, it was murder. His job was to destroy submarines, not kill sailors who were no longer a threat. But he knew others weren't so scrupulous. The war had been going on long enough that both sides had accumulated grievances and grudges. U-boats had sunk hospital ships, either deliberately or through mistakes in identification. Allied aircraft had machine gun survivors and life rafts. The rules of civilized warfare were breaking down under the strain of total war, and everyone involved was becoming more brutal, more hardened, more willing to cross lines that would have been unthinkable a few years earlier. Morrison knew his war was different from the one being fought by bomber crews over Germany or infantry soldiers in Italy. His enemy was faceless, anonymous. He never saw the men inside the submarines he destroyed. He never had to watch them die. The explosions, the sinking hulls, the oil slicks spreading across the water, these were abstractions, not human tragedies. It was easier that way. Easier to do the job without thinking too much about the consequences. His navigator and radar operator, Flight Sergeant David Hughes, had a different perspective. Hughes had served in the Merchant Navy before the war, sailing the Atlantic trade routes on cargo ships. He'd survived 2 sinkings, once spending 18 hours in a lifeboat before being rescued. He knew what it was like to be on the receiving end of a submarine attack, to feel the ship shudder from a torpedo impact, to scramble for the lifeboats while the vessel settled beneath you. He had no sympathy for U-boat crews. As far as he was concerned, every submarine they destroyed meant merchant sailors who would live to reach port safely. The partnership between Morrison and Hughes was typical of Mosquito crews. The pilot handled the flying and the weapons, while the radar operator provided navigation and target information. The 2 men had to trust each other completely. At low altitude over water, there was no room for mistakes. A moment of inattention, a miscalculation of distance, and they would both die when the Mosquito slammed into the waves at 300 miles per hour. The margin for error was measured in feet and fractions of seconds. They'd been flying together for 8 months, completing over 40 patrols. They knew each other's rhythms, each other's habits. Hughes could tell from the way Morrison moved the controls whether he was relaxed or tense. Morrison could interpret the tone of Hughes's voice over the intercom and know whether a radar contact was solid or questionable. This unspoken understanding made them one of the most effective teams in their squadron. Their kill rate was among the highest, and they'd never had to abort a mission due to equipment failure or poor coordination. But effectiveness came with a price. Both men were exhausted. The patrols were long, sometimes lasting 10 hours or more. The concentration required to fly at low altitude for extended periods was mentally draining. The constant scanning for targets, the sudden rushes of adrenaline when a submarine was spotted, the letdown afterwards when the attack was complete, all of it took a toll. They'd seen other crews crack under the strain, becoming hesitant or reckless, making mistakes that got them killed. Morrison and Hughes were determined not to become statistics, but they could feel themselves wearing down. The squadron medical officer had noticed. He'd suggested they take a break, spend a week or 2 at a rest facility away from operations. Morrison had refused. There was too much work to do, too many U-boats still operating, too many convoys that needed protection. He'd rest when the war was over. Until then, he would keep flying, keep hunting, keep destroying the enemy wherever he could find them. It was what he'd signed up for, what he was good at, and what the situation demanded. On the German side, the pressure was even more intense. By early 1944, U-boat losses had reached catastrophic levels. In some months, more boats were being sunk than were completing successful patrols. The new Type XXI U-boats, revolutionary designs with improved underwater performance and better sensors, were still months away from operational service. In the meantime, the Type 7 and Type 9 boats, designs that were fundamentally unchanged from the beginning of the war, had to continue carrying the burden of the Atlantic campaign. Captain Lieutenant Ernst Hoffman was one of the survivors. He'd been a U-boat commander since early 1941, long enough to have experienced both the glory days and the desperate struggle that followed. His first patrol had been off the coast of Africa, where he'd sunk 3 merchant ships and damaged a 4th without encountering any serious opposition. His second patrol had been less successful but still profitable, 2 ships sunk for no damage to his boat. By his 5th patrol, things had changed. Allied escorts were more numerous and more capable. Aircraft appeared at unexpected times. Attacks that would have been straightforward a year earlier now required elaborate planning and careful execution. His current boat was his 3rd. His first had been badly damaged by depth charges and was in dock for repairs when he was reassigned. His second had been sunk, though not while he was aboard. The new commander who replaced him during Hoffman's medical leave had taken the boat out and never returned. Probably destroyed by aircraft, though no one knew for certain. The boat and its entire crew had simply vanished somewhere in the North Atlantic. Now Hoffman commanded U-509, a Type IXC boat that was larger and longer range than the Type 7 but also slower to dive and more cumbersome to handle. The crew of U-509 was a mixture of veterans and new men. His executive officer, Weber, had survived 2 boats before this one. The chief engineer was on his 4th patrol. The radio operator was on his 6th. But more than half the crew were on their 1st or 2nd patrol, young men barely out of training who looked to the veterans for guidance and reassurance. Hoffman did his best to project confidence, but privately he was terrified. Not for himself, he'd made peace with the probability of his own death long ago, but for these young men who trusted him to bring them home safely. The 43 days they'd been at sea had been largely uneventful, which was simultaneously reassuring and frustrating. They'd spotted 2 convoys but had been unable to get into position to attack either one. The escorts were too alert, too numerous. Hoffman had shadowed the convoys at a distance, radioing their positions to U-boat headquarters in the hope that other boats could intercept them. But he'd learned later that no attacks had materialized. Either the other boats had been unable to find the convoys, or they'd been driven off by escorts before they could strike. Now U-509 was heading home, batteries nearly exhausted, fuel running low, food supplies reduced to the bare minimum. The crew was tired, dirty, and demoralized. They'd been at sea for 6 weeks and had nothing to show for it except survival. No ships sunk, no victories to celebrate, just a long, tense patrol through waters that seemed to be crawling with enemy forces. Hoffman knew that merely surviving was itself an achievement given current loss rates, but that was cold comfort to men who'd volunteered for the U-boat service expecting to strike meaningful blows against the enemy. The storm that morning was both a blessing and a complication. It provided cover from aircraft, but it also made navigation more difficult and increased the wear on the crew. Men who were already exhausted had to work harder to maintain the boat's position and heading through the heavy seas. Equipment that was already temperamental became more problematic in the constant motion and humidity. Hoffman had considered remaining submerged for the entire transit through the Bay of Biscay, the stretch of water between France and Britain that was heavily patrolled by Allied aircraft. But running submerged meant traveling at 3 or 4 knots instead of 15, and they didn't have enough battery capacity to make it home entirely underwater. They had to surface periodically to run the diesel engines, recharge the batteries, and make better speed. The standing orders from Donuts were clear. Surface only in darkness or in weather that grounded aircraft. The storm qualified as the latter. Hoffman had brought U-509 to periscope depth at dawn, scanning carefully before surfacing. The conditions looked good. Heavy clouds, strong winds, visibility limited by spray and rain. No aircraft would be flying in this weather. Or so he thought. When the lookout's panicked shout came, Hoffman's first instinct was disbelief. Aircraft in these conditions was impossible. But the standing order was to dive immediately on any sighting, and Hoffman's hand was already reaching for the alarm when his training overcame his instinct. He forced himself to look through the periscope one more time, to assess the situation before committing to a course of action. What he saw made his blood freeze. The aircraft was diving through the clouds directly toward them, its profile unmistakable even at a distance. Mosquito. The British submarine killer that had destroyed so many boats. The wooden wonder that moved so fast it seemed supernatural. And it was already beginning its attack run, coming in low over the waves at a speed that made evasion impossible. Hoffman's mind raced through the options. Crash dive was the standard procedure, but he knew from the reports he'd read that Mosquitoes carried weapons specifically designed to kill diving submarines. The 57mm cannon could penetrate their hull even underwater. If they dove now, they'd be at their most vulnerable, unable to maneuver, unable to fight back, just waiting to see if the incoming shells would find them before they reached safety depth. Fighting back was suicide. The deck guns were unmanned, and even if the crew could reach them in time, the Mosquito would be on them before they could train the weapons and fire. The aircraft's speed in the terrible weather made accurate gunnery impossible. They might get off a few desperate shots, but the odds of hitting anything were essentially zero. That left one option. Stay on the surface, turn toward the aircraft, and try to present the smallest possible target. The conning tower instead of the long hull. Make the British pilot's job as difficult as possible. It was a gamble, a desperate one, but Hoffman's instincts told him it was their only chance. The Mosquito was already committed to its attack run, coming in from their port side. If Hoffman could turn hard to port, putting the bow toward the aircraft, the target profile would shrink dramatically. He shouted orders. Hard left rudder. All ahead full. Gun crews to stations, though he knew they wouldn't have time to do any good. The boat responded sluggishly in the heavy seas, the bow swinging to port. Weber was staring at him with an expression that mixed trust with terror. The young officer knew this wasn't standard procedure, knew they were gambling with all their lives, but he also knew Hoffman had kept them alive this long when so many other boats had been lost. Through the periscope, Hoffman watched the Mosquito grow larger with impossible speed. He could see the details now. The wooden construction, the twin engines, the glazed nose where the pilot sat. And beneath the fuselage, the distinctive bulge that housed the 57mm cannon. The weapon that had destroyed so many of his fellow U-boat commanders. The weapon that was about to fire at his boat. The Mosquito pilot, Morrison, had spotted the U-boat's turn and recognized immediately what the German commander was trying to do. Clever. Most U-boat captains either dove immediately or froze in panic. This one was trying to make himself harder to hit by presenting a narrow target. It showed experience and quick thinking, qualities that Morrison respected even in an enemy. But it wasn't going to save them. Morrison adjusted his angle of approach slightly, compensating for the U-boat's turn. Hughes, in the seat behind him, was calling out range estimates. 1,200 yards. 1,000. 800. Morrison's hands were steady on the controls, his eyes fixed on the U-boat's conning tower. He could see figures moving on the deck now, probably the gun crew trying desperately to man their weapons. They wouldn't make it. This would be over in seconds. At 600 yards, Morrison opened fire. The 57mm cannon roared, its distinctive hammering sound filling the cockpit despite the soundproofing. The recoil pushed the nose down as expected, and Morrison compensated automatically, keeping the target in his sights. He could see his shells impacting, fountains of water erupting around the U-boat as some rounds fell short. He adjusted, raising his aim slightly, and suddenly the shells were striking home. The first hit demolished the forward deck gun before the crew could reach it. The second and third shells struck the conning tower, punching through the armored sides and exploding inside. Morrison held the trigger down, walking his fire along the length of the visible hull. The 57mm cannon fired rapidly, each shell following the previous one in quick succession. He could see pieces of the U-boat flying off, metal fragments and equipment spinning through the air. Hoffman felt the impacts through the entire boat. The first shells hitting the conning tower killed the lookouts instantly and sent fragments of metal ricocheting through the cramped space. He was knocked down by the blast, his ears ringing, blood running down his face from a cut on his forehead. Weber was shouting something, but Hoffman couldn't hear him over the ringing in his ears and the continuing explosions as more shells found their target. The boat was shuddering with each impact. Hoffman could feel it, could sense the damage being inflicted on his vessel. They were being torn apart, systematically destroyed by weapons against which they had no defense. He tried to pull himself up, tried to see what was happening, but another explosion sent him sprawling again. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of explosives. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the firing stopped. The Mosquito had pulled up and away, its ammunition expended. Morrison banked sharply, gaining altitude while Hughes craned his neck to see the results of their attack. The U-boat was still afloat, but it was clearly in distress. The conning tower was wrecked, and there was smoke pouring from somewhere inside the hull. As they watched, the submarine's bow began to dip below the surface. Hoffman regained his feet, wiping blood from his eyes. The control room was a shambles. Pipes were broken, instruments were shattered, and water was coming in from somewhere. Weber was still conscious, still shouting orders to the crew, trying to assess the damage. The reports came back quickly and painted a grim picture. The pressure hull was breached in at least 3 places. The forward torpedo room was flooding. The deck gun was destroyed. The radio was out. The steering was damaged. And worst of all, they couldn't dive. The hydroplanes were jammed, and even if they weren't, the flooding would drag them straight to the bottom. They were crippled, defenseless, and trapped on the surface. Hoffman's gamble had failed. The narrow profile had made them harder to hit, but not impossible. The Mosquito's firepower had been too much, its accuracy too good. Now U-509 was dying, sinking slowly beneath the waves, and there was nothing Hoffman could do to save her. The order to abandon ship was the hardest thing Hoffman had ever done. These men had trusted him, followed his orders, believed he would bring them home safely. Now he was telling them to get out, to take their chances in the freezing Atlantic rather than go down with the boat. Some of them were already dead, killed in the attack. Others were injured, barely able to move. But the rest scrambled for the exits, desperate to get off before the boat sank completely. Hoffman made sure Weber got out, physically shoving the younger officer toward the ladder when he tried to stay and help. Then he moved through the boat one last time, checking every compartment, making sure no one was left behind. In the forward torpedo room, already half flooded, he found 2 men trapped by debris. He pulled them free, helped them to the ladder, sent them up to the deck. The water was up to his waist now, icy cold, and he could feel the boat settling beneath him. He was the last man off, as tradition demanded. As he climbed through the hatch onto what remained of the deck, he could see his crew in the water, some in life rafts, others clinging to debris, all of them watching as their boat went down. U-509 sank bow first, sliding beneath the waves with a gurgling sound that seemed almost mournful. Hoffman watched until the stern disappeared, then turned and jumped into the water himself. The cold was shocking, driving the breath from his lungs. He swam toward the nearest life raft, where Weber and several others were already huddled. Strong hands pulled him aboard, and he collapsed into the bottom of the raft, exhausted and defeated. Around him, he could hear the voices of his crew calling to each other, trying to account for everyone. The count was grim. 14 men dead or missing. 33 in the water, injured, freezing, but alive. Morrison had seen the U-boat sink and knew there would be survivors in the water. Standard procedure at this point was to radio the position to headquarters and let surface vessels handle the rescue. His job was done. The submarine was destroyed, no longer a threat to Allied shipping. But as he circled the area, he could see the life rafts and the men in the water, and something made him hesitate. Hughes saw it too. The German sailors weren't enemies anymore, just men trying to survive in brutal conditions. The same conditions that merchant sailors faced when their ships were torpedoed. The same cold water, the same desperate struggle. Hughes had been there, had felt that terror. He knew what those men were going through. He keyed his microphone. "Morrison, we should call it in. They need help." Morrison nodded, already reaching for the radio. He transmitted the position and a brief description of the situation. Survivors in the water, location confirmed, immediate assistance required. The response came back within minutes. A destroyer was being diverted to the area, estimated time of arrival 90 minutes. Morrison acknowledged and continued circling. He didn't have to stay. He could have headed back to base, letting the destroyer handle things. But somehow it seemed wrong to just leave. These men were the enemy, yes, but they were also sailors who'd fought bravely and lost. They deserved better than to be abandoned to die of exposure in the North Atlantic. So Morrison circled, keeping the survivors in sight, occasionally dropping a marker flare to make sure the destroyer would be able to find them quickly. Hoffman, in his life raft, saw the Mosquito circling overhead and understood what was happening. The British pilot was staying with them, making sure they'd be rescued. It was an act of mercy that Hoffman hadn't expected, a reminder that even in the midst of total war, some human decency remained. He raised his hand in a gesture of acknowledgement, though he doubted the pilot could see it. The 90 minutes until the destroyer arrived felt like hours. Men died in the life rafts, their injuries or the cold claiming them before help could arrive. Others simply slipped beneath the waves, too exhausted to keep swimming. By the time HMS Vanquisher arrived and began pulling survivors from the water, only 28 of U-509's crew were still alive. Hoffman and Weber were among them, along with most of the control room crew who'd been relatively protected during the attack. As Hoffman was hauled aboard the destroyer, wrapped in blankets and given hot tea, he looked up and saw the Mosquito making one final pass overhead before turning for home. He understood now why U-boat crews feared that aircraft so much. It wasn't just the speed or the firepower, though both were formidable. It was the combination of capability and the skill of the men who flew it. The Mosquito and its crew represented everything that had gone wrong for Germany in the Battle of the Atlantic. Allied technological superiority, tactical innovation, and professional competence, all focused on the single mission of destroying U-boats. Morrison and Hughes made it back to base without incident, landing just as the weather began to clear. During the debriefing, Morrison filed his report with the usual clinical precision. 1 submarine destroyed, probable Type 9 based on size and profile. Heavy damage observed, vessel sank approximately 4 minutes after attack. Survivors observed in water, position reported, rescue confirmed. The intelligence officer congratulated them on another successful patrol and marked another kill on Morrison's growing score. That evening, in the officers' mess, Morrison found himself thinking about the U-boat commander. The man who'd tried to turn and present a narrow target, who'd almost pulled off an impossible maneuver that might have saved his boat. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.